Howdy, y'all, and welcome to the EEARSS podcast, produced by Terrier TV. I am Frank Robb. That is Bill. That is Cindy. What's happening, guys? How goes it?
It proceeds.
It does proceed, doesn't it? I am ridiculously excited about today's podcast. This is we've been talking about this since it came to fruition, and I'm very, very excited. Thoughts? Am I only one that's excited? Okay.
Oh no,
All right, it's not just me.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is pretty interesting.
This is very, very interesting stuff. So, let's introduce our guest and
Let's
jump
do
into it.
Let's go right to it.
So today on the show we have Mr. Adrian Shine from the Loch Ness Project. How you doing, Adrian?
Doing very well, thank you. Sitting by the loch. It's gone dark for us now, of course. You're a little bit behind us in time, but anyway, good to talk to you.
Likewise, sir. Thank you again so much for being here. I know I keep saying that, but we're sincerely blessed by this opportunity to chat with you. I know personally, and I think I told you this in a quick conversation we had before, as a kid, watching everything you guys were doing over there is, pulling sonar across the loch, looking at your past studies, admiring that magnificent beard you have, going through all the different things you had going on over there. It was one of the many things that drew me to the world of science, and made it even more interesting to me. So, I mean, I'm sure there's many people that can say that about these types of situations and studies, but for me personally, it was a huge draw. So, thank you for everything you've been doing for so long.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to have these things said. I can't deny I've had a great deal of fun over the years, and bringing a little bit of conventional science into what we were doing, I think actually did open windows for quite a lot of people. We had a lot of students working as volunteers, obviously attracted by the excitement of the possibilities there were in Loch Ness, but also because of the work we were doing, it introduced them to the scientific method. We were doing as much work on plankton and fish and sediments as ever we were looking for something controversial. And many of them went on to become teachers of biology and other disciplines. Some of them even did PhDs.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's got to be very humbling to know what a big part of that you had.
It was a good way of working because it kept everything a little bit more level, a little bit more reasonable, a bit more credible.
Yes, sir.
Than some of the work, some of the things that people were doing, some of the things that people were speculating about. It kind of grounded the thing a bit, and that made it sustainable.
Okay.
As an interesting subject. And of course, as time went on and the stereotypes of the 1930s, the humpbacked sea serpent and the plesiosaur idea, these stereotypes were eliminated as the 60s and 70s drew on, and yet still people were reporting and insisting they were seeing unusual creatures in Loch Ness, and we thought we ought to finish the job. And that's why nowadays it's really a lateral thinking game as to what the loch could sustain conceivably. A matter of possibilities rather than probabilities, if you like.
Makes complete sense. Where did you originally get your passion, or what brought you to looking into all this in the very beginning?
Okay, well, it started for me where it started for the first investigators of the subject. It started at sea. It was on the east coast of England when I was a little boy, nearly 8 years old, and I saw my first sea serpent. At least that's what my father named what we were looking at. I found out the next day what it actually was. There were water birds flying along by the horizon, but it sparked an interest in me, which as a schoolboy, I then pursued by reading the books of the investigators at Loch Ness, people like Tim Dinsdale, Ted Holliday, and others. I followed the subject, through my teens, and ultimately thought, well, I really ought to have a go. This is fascinating. I was always encouraged to be a bit of a naturalist, but there's no doubting that as a naturalist, one of the most exciting things we could imagine was, well, monsters. And that's what drew me, I think. So it started at sea, just as it started at sea for the first investigators of the subject, Rupert Gould, who had written a book in 1930 called The Case for the Sea Serpent, which an uncle of mine actually gave me a copy of in my teens. So that was another point at which I was inspired. And he subsequently wrote a book on Loch Ness in 1934, just after the first year. We've had 91 years of this, remember, suggesting that one of the sea serpents that he had advocated had actually got into Loch Ness and probably might not get out again, and that's where it could be identified. And to some extent, he was right, because the multi-humped form of sea serpent, the very one that turned up off your coasts in New England in 1817 and was seen by hundreds of people, that is indeed what we discovered in Loch Ness to have been caused by ship's wakes, because Loch Ness is part of the Caledonian Canal. Vessels go through it, they make displacement wakes, which when viewed from the side in calm weather give rise to this remarkably solid train of apparently humps, but they're actually the waves caused by the wake itself.
It's interesting where people's minds go sometimes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we confirm, I think, there's a debate as to whether or not myths, legends, dragons, that sort of thing, come from things which were truly in nature, or whether we imagine things in nature, that is, generated by ourselves, and then we look to nature for confirmation. So the mythical serpents, which the Vikings were very keen on, maybe we found confirmation in those in the wakes left initially by large marine animals, like whales, and finally by powered vessels, because when your people were looking at sea serpents off the harbour of Gloucester, Massachusetts, steamships were just beginning to appear on the coasts there. And of course, steamships, powered vessels, make wakes on calm water, which are visible. Sailing ships don't, of course, because they're becalmed. They don't go anywhere. But powered vessels do, and they make these wakes, which in calm weather are visible if you're looking at them from a low down and from the side. And that, I think, had a lot to do with your New England sea serpent. But it also had everything to do with the first stereotype, the multi-hump stereotypes that were turning up in Loch Ness. So we look to nature to confirm the things that not so much the things that we imagine or want to be there, we see perhaps confirmation of the things that are supposed to be there. So we knew that sea serpents were supposed to have these sort of humpy backs. And there in Loch Ness, we saw humpy backs.
Do you remember when it was for you that you went from, the possibility of believing there was a giant sea serpent in Loch Ness to the reality of it being boat wakes?
It was about, well, it wasn't just boat wakes. There was another stereotype too. At sea, things progressed from sea serpents. About 1850, things changed because of fossils that had been found on the south coast of England of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Expectations, I think in a way, trying to become more rational, thought that perhaps the sea serpents that so many people were reporting were actually living plesiosaurs that had not become extinct. And that was the other stereotype which coexisted at Loch Ness with the idea of the multi-hump sea serpents. Well, ultimately, we found that these long-necked creatures, which were reported on Loch Ness, not so much as the humps, about 20% of these heads and necks, which of course were the exciting thing, again, were only seen in calm weather. And what sort of creatures might there be in Loch Ness with these flexible swan-like necks? Well, the answer, of course, one answer was swans, or in our case, mergansers and cormorants.
Wow, okay.
So,
that makes sense.
So, yeah, so anatomically it did. The thing that was missing was scale, because people were reporting these heads and necks to be about 4 or 5 feet high, which really is a lot more than the water bird. But then we found that our vision, our perception, judges size by a subconscious measurement of distance. And we measure distance very often by familiar objects within our field of view at the same distance as an unknown object, for example. If there's a boat at the same distance, we know how big the boat is broadly. To know the size of an object, we have to at least subconsciously know the distance. Now, on water, there is a texture when there are waves. You can sort of judge distance to a point by the receding texture of the waves, like a carpet stretching away from you. But on calm water, you can't. And so there are no cues to your judgment of distance. And when that is lacking, you cannot judge the distance and therefore size of an unknown object. But you see, on Loch Ness, it wouldn't be an unknown object because everybody knows what's in Loch Ness. There's a monster in Loch Ness, and it's got a long neck and looks like a plesiosaur. Well, so does a water bird. It's just smaller. But on calm water, it can look a lot bigger. And that's what we discovered. And so we moved on from that. And the question you asked was when we realized that. It was about 1976, to be precise.
Wow.
When I began expeditions, well, I was continuing expeditions at Loch Moura, which is not Loch Ness, it is on the west coast. And I was one of the underwater men of the 1970s. Some interesting pictures had been taken underwater at Loch Ness of a flipper. Looked very much like a flipper, and I believed it. I believed it was a flipper. At the same time, I was working at Loch Moura, which had the same monster tradition. Loch Ness is not unique. And you have your own lakes, Lake Champlain. In Canada, there's Lake Okanagan. But at Loch Moura, The difference was that the water was clear. And that was when I had my little underwater hide that I built. That was in the winter of 1973 and 4. And I'd attracted a bit of a following of accomplices, if you like, to help me work at Loch Ness. And we worked quietly until 75. And then the Loch Ness people began to know about us, and I was given the support by the Member of Parliament, David James, and Sir Peter Scott, who was a very well-known naturalist in Britain. And the thing got a lot bigger. And the Loch Ness hands, if you like, the people who were working at Loch Ness, all came to Loch Ness instead. We'd found that the underwater pictures that had been taken in the early 70s, two sets, the flipper picture of 72, which impressed me at the time, and then some much less impressive pictures taken in 1975, we realized that they were the bottom of the loch. And the flipper picture, I'm afraid, was faked.
Oh, wow.
It was, an outline was drawn around it. I mean, it was just the silt storm, and the camera was dragging in the bottom. We know all that now. And we knew it then. We found out in 76 that was the case. I was a bit slow to believe that the flipper picture was faked, because I didn't think investigators would do that. But I'm afraid they did. And that's when my skepticism began, but where we realized that there might be something more valuable in continuing to investigate Loch Ness. In a way, it was the way the cachet of Loch Ness, the public cachet and interest in Loch Ness, allowed us to do some general science to the extent that we would not have got support in any other way. So I have to admit to that. It all began, I think, when I was sitting in my little submersible looking out of the portholes under Loch Ness for something big to swim over the top. It never did. But a lot of fish swam by, and I could even see the plankton through these windows. And that diversified my whole interest to far beyond monsters. And today, we look, I suppose, at the subject in a very different way. We see it as a vehicle for maintaining interest in the natural world, but also a way, sort of a mirror to ourselves, the way we believe in things, the way we see things. It could have a value in that respect. We found out a lot about the limitations of human perception, but also we are beginning to wonder about the mechanisms whereby we want to believe in Loch Ness monsters. I mean, we've been looking for them unsuccessfully for 91 years.
That's very interesting.
It is really, because you see, in a way, it's an accessible idea. Oh, I also continued with all the sonar that you remember, because in the final days of the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, which was working at Loch Ness before my time, they had got some interesting sonar contacts. And so I worked with sonar to clear up the remaining issues, because we came back to Loch Ness, you see, in the 80s. You probably remember the 70s.
Yeah, that was a little bit before my time.
I remember
Yeah, yeah, Bill does. It was before my time.
Okay, maybe it was the 80s. But I did a lot of sonar work. And we did always accept that they weren't necessarily monsters, but we thought we had a duty to find out what they were. And to some extent, I think we overestimated the strength of some of the contacts. We are now aware of all the issues that can creep in with the loch's steep underwater side walls, which can produce some peculiar echoes, and there are even bits of junk and debris that have been jettisoned by vessels moving through the canal, which can cause sonar contacts. So that was a sort of an aside with what was going on. But now we see the final denouement, if you like, was when we assisted in an expedition, a survey, an environmental DNA survey, just a couple of years ago.
We were just wondering about this.
Well, it was led by Professor Gamble from the University of Otago in New Zealand, and we sampled Loch Ness end to end, side to side, and top to bottom. The great thing about environmental DNA is the field work is really just a question of collecting water, because the cells of aquatic creatures protect the DNA for about a week, sometimes more, in water. Fresh water is bad for DNA. The cells, shed cells from skin, fecal matter, mucus, they stay there. And all we've got to do is collect the water. And then the clever bit happens in the laboratories, of which there were a number around the world, which Professor Gemmell had accumulated into a collaboration. And of course, there was no reptile DNA. Well, we never expected that there was, but there wasn't. There was no aquatic mammal DNA. And he also addressed the issue of what I call the modern fish theories, because starting in '76, we did come up, and I was partly guilty of it, of thinking of the big three, we call them, fish theories. And the first one, which is my favorite one, was that perhaps sturgeon had something to do with it, what people were seeing. Maybe starting the tradition. There was no sturgeon DNA.
Interesting.
The next theory was the European catfish, which is, well, it's a lot bigger than the ones you've got, actually, potentially, and they live an awfully long time, and this caused those factors were used by a chap called Dick Rayner to suggest that one or two huge European catfish might have survived from introductions by man by Victorians during the 19th century. They're very long-lived. They wouldn't breed because they need a water temperature of about 20 degrees to breed. And we don't get that in Loch Ness very often. They're not indigenous to Britain, but they've been introduced to various places. And so some of the people seeing things describe them as very ugly. Well, you know, the European catfish is pretty ugly. So it fits the bill in that respect. And the final theory was the gigantic eel, the idea of perhaps ordinary eels coming into Loch Ness, and instead of leaving to go to sea, to the Sargasso Sea to spawn and die, some eels might just get bigger and bigger and bigger in Loch Ness. And of course, this harks back in a way to those humpy stereotypes I was talking about, the sea serpent monsters.
Right.
Well, there wasn't any catfish DNA, there wasn't any sturgeon DNA, and so the theory that the media rather liked was this idea of the gigantic eels, because things have moved on, you see, in terms of the way the media interact with the public. Once upon a time, they said, "Oh dear me, Loch Ness Monster is just a big eel." Whereas, in fact, now, of course, they say, "Oh, the Loch Ness Monster could be a big eel, and that would be a big deal," because expectations are more realistic now. Well, of course, when you think about it, what we concluded in the end was that the DNA survey could not confirm or refute these big three fish theories, because my Atlantic sturgeon wouldn't be in the loch more than once in a blue moon. It is a migratory fish. It would enter freshwater. Just occasionally, they do in Britain. They are navigationally challenged, if you like. They blunder up a river and, of course, try and leave again without finding a spawning partner. And so the DNA survey would be very lucky to find one of my sturgeon in the loch at all. And as for the catfish, well, if there are only one or two of them around, there might not have been enough DNA anyway. We didn't find any DNA from otters or cormorants, and we know they visit the loch, and that would be because of the low amount. And as for the big eel theory, well, of course, there was lots and lots of eel DNA. But, of course, it was exactly the same DNA for all the eels, because the theory is that it's an ordinary anguilla that might get bigger. And so that's the lateral nature of the thinking game that is now being played. And long may that continue.
Yes, sir. No doubt about it. So it leads me to a couple of more questions here. When you hear, I know we're going to get to a couple other things here in a second, but when you hear about other myths, as far as things like that people claim to have seen globally, like Yetis and things of that nature, what from the perspective of you working in a situation like this forever, what kind of mindset do you have on things of that nature when you hear about them?
All right. Well, they are related, I think. But I think it's important that I make the point that having studied sea serpents, I'm completing a book on them, and Loch Ness monsters.
I say, by all means, tell us about your book too.
Okay. Well, my conclusion is that witnesses are not only honest. Few people deny that, would suggest otherwise, but that they are not seeing things that they necessarily want to see. They're seeing things, as I said earlier, they are supposed to see, but actually they are reporting what they are seeing. I believe that my own research vindicates the eyewitnesses. There is a difference between perceiving something and interpreting it. And so if somebody says to me that they have seen this succession of humps on the loch, I'll certainly believe it, because I know that you can see a succession of humps on the loch. If they say it was definitely an animal, I would say, well, that is an interpretation. It is completely different to the perception. It is, if you like, simply an opinion. At Loch Moura, I saw a monster on my first visit, rowing a boat in the dusk. That's what I was doing. It turned out to be a rock about 4 inches high. So I couldn't believe my own eyes. I don't believe the interpretation of other people's eyes either, but I've come to recognize that they are reporting broadly what they are seeing.
What were your thoughts originally whenever you saw that creature that what you thought was a creature that ended up being a rock? When you were paddling up to that, what was on your mind?
Well, I thought, oh, I've achieved what I've come to do. I better not move in the direction of the other way right now. And I did actually row towards the object.
There you go. I have the same problem with large animals in the water, so I get that one a little bit.
yeah, yes. You have to make that decision, don't you?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you have to make a conscious choice there at some point. You're either all in or you're all out.
You either go, yes, you either go in or you don't. Well, I was a young man, and young men are immortal.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. So in we went, and so I've made the point that I think that the witnesses are reporting what they are seeing. I won't necessarily endorse what they are interpreting in terms of what they are seeing. And so in terms of the Yeti or your Bigfoot,
yep,
I think people are sincerely reporting, most of them, what they're seeing. I know there are a lot of people trudging about with big feet.
Yes, sir,
and
that's true too.
I'm sure that is great fun. And British Columbia has got a lot to answer for, hasn't it?
Yes, sir, it really does.
Not only is it the beginning of your Bigfoot tradition, but just off the coast you have your Cadborosaurus. You've heard of that?
No, I haven't heard of that one particularly. No, sir.
No, it's your version of the sea. Well, it's a Canadian version of the sea serpent.
Really?
Off Vancouver Island. Yeah, yes, it comes down into your waters too. I mean, the border isn't far away, is it?
No, yeah, it's not that far away in the grand scheme of things.
Around Seattle. Yeah.
So you were telling us about your book. Tell us about your book and what that's all about.
Oh, the Sea Serpent book. Well, I'm trying to complete it. It may be published in Scotland within about 6 months.
Awesome.
I would say. But I trace the sea serpent tradition from what I believe are Viking roots through the later Scandinavian Norwegian sea serpent, which a bishop at the time was collecting reports about, the very credible ones. The identical sea serpent that appeared off the coast of Massachusetts in 1817 and in other years succeeding that, known as the Great New England Sea Serpent, and some reports made by the French Navy of some odd creatures off Vietnam, some reports from the Atlantic, and indeed from around Vancouver Island. So, in other words, the sorts of things that are seen and been attributed first to sea serpents, and then I would maintain after 1850 sea monsters in all these places. And I advance some explanations in terms of the known marine megafauna, which in the 19th century, which was the sort of heyday of these reports, the whaling had diminished and depleted the whale population of the globe enormously, and also sealing, the elephant seals and the sea lions of California. They were much depleted. And so now we see the recovery of those species, and we can begin to see in their behavior, sometimes unrecognized behavior previously, justification for some of these bizarre experiences. And so really there's a conservation message behind it. As we understand the current creatures of the sea and their behavior, we may see less monsters, but our appreciation of those creatures might be some warranty for their future.
That's a great message by all means. It's great that you're able to do so much through something that started as a monster in an area of the world, and you've been able to turn it into huge conservation impacts. Truly, it's incredible.
Well, I think it is part of the story. Yes.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
It is a conservation message. We reduce the populations of these creatures to the extent that the contemporary sailors of that day would very seldom encounter them.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
We picture them being more of these creatures around in the past. That's not true. We're only just getting them back. And finally, I'd have to say, I hope we leave enough resources in the ocean for them to increase their numbers.
Yes.
It's one thing not harpooning whales, but we shouldn't be chopping up sand lances for fertilizer either.
You have a very valid point. Yes, sir. There's no doubt about it. So over the years, you've had to have met so many people doing this work, and you must have some very interesting stories about people you met and stories they had or things that happened along the way. Can you maybe share with us an interesting story someone shared with you about a Loch Ness Monster experience?
Well, I suppose, oh dear me, it put me on the spot there.
Yeah, by all means, there's nothing you have to share, but I'm sure you have some interesting ones.
There was one great expeditioner, we call him, who turned up on many of our expeditions, who's called Ivor Newby, and he had an amphibious car, and he used to drive it into the loch and around, and I think he was trying to impress one of our young ladies and took her out in this car, and out he went. And then we were aware that he was driving back. He'd left the plug out.
Oh, no.
The thing was sinking. And we had to haul it out. It was quite funny. He then attempted to sell the car by demonstrating it in a river, and again he forgot to put the plug in. I don't think he sold it on that occasion, but we did attract a number of eccentrics, yeah, and I'm probably one of them.
Most of us in the animal world have some part of it, buddy. There's no doubt in it. Usually most of us in the conservation world and in the wildlife world have some portion of that to keep everything sane in our own heads, I think.
Well, yes, and it has been fun, and I'm sure you've had your share of it too.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's and like I said, I can't even begin to tell you the impact. So my side of the crocodilian side has been something our whole family's been doing forever, but this story that you've been part of over there, and really, I mean, the Loch Ness Project in general, where you've went with it from here, from that point, has been something we have discussed and just been enamored with from the beginning. And your scientific approach to it all is so it gives me a little bit of hope, if that makes any sense. It brings light to a very interesting subject, and it's neat to see it from that side, from someone with a science approach, as my uncle would say, someone who's waxing scientific.
Well, the way I feel about it is that the conventional science that we've done has shed unexpected light into the argument itself, but that it's not reduced the fun of it. People think that if you introduce a bit of rationality and science, it might reduce the fun. No, it doesn't, because it makes you think. So we don't look We're not keeping looking. We've started thinking, and that's just as much fun.
Yes, sir. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. Mr. Shine, we thank you so much for joining us on this podcast and chatting with us. I know it's late over there. It means the world to me and Bill and Cindy that you took a time to allow us to chat with you and ask you some questions and have you share your experiences and truly your life's passion. It's been an absolute honor, sir.
You're most welcome, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, sir. Hope to catch up with you again sometime soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Goodbye.
Bye. Well, that was an absolute blast. What a sweetheart that guy is.
Amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's anytime you can talk to somebody that has that kind of experience and that kind of, truly has done that kind of a deep dive into a subject. You play on words or not, the guy truly has.
Oh, yeah.
It's been his life since he was a kid.
Yeah.
It's real. You can just glean so much cool information out of somebody like that. That's a guy I could chat with for an entire week straight and not ever get bored by any means.
The thing that struck me was that, how he covered so many bases. They looked at it from all these different angles, and they went about trying to prove that it was, or end up disproving it.
That's what was interesting. Yeah, they didn't try to disprove it. They let the science disprove it.
I love it because I've always been what I used to think was a weird person, because I can believe very fantastical things and wonder about things like, Loch Ness monsters and Bigfoot, but I'm also a science-minded person. So I used to think those things were mutually exclusive, and I used to have trouble rationalizing to people, well, how can you be a science person but you believe X, Y? And I think he really did a great job of bringing that home, that they go hand in hand.
They do.
Science isn't about starting with one belief and proving or disproving. It's about following the science.
If some kind of dinosaur showed up in Loch Ness tomorrow, he'd be the first person to be all about it.
Yep.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's such a unique perspective on life. Truly, there's a lot of people that could get a lot out of that. Yeah.
Yep.
I hope you are getting a lot of that, because that was something else. That was a very special opportunity to chat with that man. Man, I got a little teary-eyed there in the beginning, just listening to him talk about it and kind of break it down. It's
right.
emotional.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, wow. I think we should end the podcast before I ruin it.
Okay. There we go.
Thank you all for tuning into the EEARSS podcast this afternoon. You can find EEARSS on all platforms by searching EEARSS. EEARSS on all platforms by searching EEARSS, because that kind of makes sense. EEARSS, EEARSS. Or EEARSS.org, alligatorrob with 2Bs.com. We're there everywhere. Leave us a comment. Tell us if you enjoyed the show. Maybe somebody you might have in mind you want us to talk to sometime. Give us a yell. Let us know. Thank you to Edna Wilson with Celebrate Remax Aerospace and Pat Fisher Nissan for your sponsorship of our program. We'll catch you all next week. Bye-bye.